The wind howled across the Kansas plains like a wounded animal, December snow lashing sideways through the frozen air. Night had fallen early, swallowing the endless grassland in ghostly silence broken only by the desperate crunch of footsteps through knee-deep drifts. Eleanor Hargrove pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, its fraying edges no match for the bitter cold that cut through her bones. In her arms, a baby barely 10 days old whimpered against her chest, wrapped in what remained of a woolen blanket that had once been white but now bore the stains of their desperate journey. She stumbled forward, each step a battle against exhaustion and the weight of carrying her child through this frozen wasteland. Her lips were cracked raw from wind and thirst, her eyes scanning the dim outline of a distant structure, a ranch house with golden light spilling from its windows and smoke rising from the chimney like a prayer answered. "Please don't be a mirage," she whispered to the wind. The porch steps groaned under her weight as she climbed them on trembling legs. Her gloved hand hovered above the weathered door, then fell 3 times in soft knocks, nearly lost to the storm's fury. The door opened with a groan of old hinges. A tall man stood in the doorway, broad-shouldered beneath a dark coat thrown over rough flannel, snow dusting his boots and the grey beard that framed his weathered face. His eyes were steel grey, not cold, but unreadable as winter sky. Eleanor's voice barely rose above the blizzard's roar. "We got nowhere to go, sir." The man's gaze didn't meet hers. Instead, it fixed on the child in her arms, the tiny face peeking from wool, flushed and shivering. He watched the baby breathe, counting each small rise and fall of the chest. Then, after a long pause that stretched like eternity, he said quietly, "Then you belong here." He stepped back, leaving the door open. No hand offered, no name given. He simply turned and walked inside, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. Eleanor followed, the heat from the fire greeting her like a stranger's unexpected kindness. The door closed behind her with a solid thud, sealing out the storm's rage. The cabin was clean but quiet, one large room with a stone hearth, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a small cot pushed close to the fire. Everything had its place, as if the house itself had been waiting. The man returned with a heavy wool blanket and laid it gently on the cot. "You can sleep there," he said. "There's water in the kettle. You'll find a ladle by the stove." She nodded, throat too tight for words. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "I'll be out in the barn. If the baby cries, don't worry. I hear things even when I try not to." Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with the crackling fire and the first warmth she'd felt in days. Above the mantel hung a framed drawing, 2 faces rendered in loving pencil strokes. A woman with kind eyes and a boy no older than 5, his hair tousled like hay in summer wind. The lines were soft, careful, frozen in time. Eleanor laid the baby on the cot and tucked the blanket higher around his chin. He stirred but didn't wake, his tiny fists curled against the wool. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel hunted. She sat beside the fire, boots soaked through, feet numb, and stared into the dancing flames. Outside, the storm thickened, but inside something had shifted. Not warmth exactly, not safety, not yet. But room. Room to breathe, to exist, and maybe, just maybe, room to stay. Who was this man? She wondered, studying the drawing again. And what ghost lived in this house with him? Underscore 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 underscore. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through frost-covered windows. The fire had died to embers, but a fresh pot of porridge sat steaming on the table, filling the air with warmth she'd almost forgotten existed. She spooned a few careful bites, but each mouthful tasted like ash. Guilt and shame lingered stronger than hunger. On a small shelf, she noticed a leather pouch containing a faded locket. Inside was her mother's wedding photograph, worn to sepia by her trembling fingers. The sight of it brought back memories she tried to bury. Caleb. Caleb Hargrove had been handsome and dangerous, with swagger in his step and a gun at his hip. He'd courted her under the willow by the saloon, promising adventure beyond their dusty town. His laugh had drawn her in like honey draws flies. She'd believed in his promises. Believed in the idea of being loved. But those guns had led him down a dark path, bank heists, train robberies, a trail of whispered rumors and spilled blood. Eleanor hadn't joined his crimes, but she stood by him. Love could build strange sanctuaries and dangerous prisons. When they finally caught Caleb, the whole town gathered to watch him hang at dawn. Eleanor had hidden in a wagon nearby, forced to witness his final moments. He hadn't died quietly, his face twisted in rage and fear, his voice cut short by the rope's bite. After his death, the world turned against her. Church doors slammed shut. Shopkeepers refused her business. A woman spat at her feet in the street. They said she wore his guilt like she'd worn his name, proudly, and that was enough to condemn her. She'd moved to an abandoned cabin at the town's edge, surviving on stale biscuits and well water so deep she nearly lost consciousness hauling up the bucket. The nights were worst, when the wind stalked her and her baby's cries echoed in the empty air. One morning, she'd found the baby's blanket frozen to the crib rail. He'd whimpered when she touched him, and she'd realized then that if she stayed, he would starve before spring. So she'd packed her few belongings in winter's dead heart, a frayed dress her mother had sewn, the locket worn smooth by tears, a carved wooden toy she'd made herself. She'd pressed the baby to her chest and whispered through her tears, "We have to go. For you." The trek through deep snow had been brutal. Eleanor had stumbled with each step, arms aching from carrying her son, eyes red from wind and determination. She'd focused on one goal, movement, always forward. By nightfall, she'd found herself on a ridge overlooking a pale valley. Exhausted, she dug a shallow snow trench and held her whimpering son tight, humming soft lullabies Caleb used to sing when they'd lain beneath stars, songs that now felt like shards in her heart. She'd seen the ranch house then, just a glimmer of light in an ocean of white, and prayed it wasn't her undoing. Now, sitting in its warmth, she wondered if prayers were sometimes answered in the most unexpected ways. Underscore 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 underscore. The days passed in quiet rhythm. Eleanor rose before dawn, fed the chickens, shoveled snow from the stable path, and chopped vegetables for stew. The rancher, she'd learned his name was Wes Thatcher, never asked for help, but she gave it anyway. They spoke only when necessary, about supplies or weather or the baby. She never asked about the photographs or the names carved in the beam above the hearth. He never asked where she'd come from or what she'd lost. But something was shifting, subtle as morning mist. The baby was growing stronger, beginning to kick his little legs and smile at sunlight through the window. One morning, while Eleanor mashed boiled carrots, he let out a sudden giggle that startled them both. Wes had been on the porch fixing a chair leg. At the sound, he froze mid-motion, hammer idle in his hand. He didn't speak, but he sat there longer than necessary, just listening. That night, Eleanor found herself staring at a small bundle of cloth she'd discovered in a linen chest, a baby shirt, blue checkered and soft with age. It had belonged to another child. She should have left it untouched, but instead she sat by the fire and began to mend it, needle trembling in her fingers. Wes appeared in the doorway, arms full of kindling. He paused just long enough to see the pain that flickered across her face before turning to add wood to the fire. The flames caught quickly, throwing warm light across the floor. Neither spoke, but something passed between them in that silence. The next morning, she found a wool cap folded beside the baby's crate, perfectly sized, as if measured by careful hands. She never asked who left it there. Underscore 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 underscore. By late February, the thaw began. Green shoots picked through the snow along the path to the barn. Eleanor planted potatoes in a narrow trench and patched the chicken coop roof with bark and tar. Each night, the fire burned warmer. Each morning, her son laughed louder. Wes remained silent, but his actions spoke volumes. He built a small bench by the door so Eleanor could sit in the sun while nursing the baby. He repaired a cracked window with wax paper to keep out the wind. When she sliced her hand peeling turnips, he wordlessly cleaned the cut and wrapped it in linen. These gloves were too small anyway, he said, handing her a pair of worn leather mittens. No promises, no questions, just the quiet rhythm of two people doing what needed doing. One afternoon, Eleanor came in from the garden to find Wes standing by the baby's crate, one callous finger being grasped by tiny hands. The look on his face, caught between awe and grief, disappeared the moment he saw her. "He's got a strong grip," Wes said, stepping back quickly. "He does," Eleanor nodded. Then, as if the words weighed more than stones, Wes added softly, "So did mine." They stood in the silence of that shared truth, two people with different losses but the same hollow ache. "Thank you for the cap," Eleanor said finally. Wes shrugged. It was just sitting there. She smiled faintly. "Well, it fits." That night, she tucked the mended blue shirt around her baby and whispered, "You're safe now," not as a wish, but as something she truly believed. Outside, Wes sat on the porch listening to wind move through the trees. For the first time in 7 winters, the cold didn't feel so sharp. Underscore 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 underscore. The stranger rode in at dusk, dust clinging to his long coat, his horse favoring its left hind leg. He was worn in the way men get when they've seen too much and remembered it all. Wes spotted him from the porch, hand drifting near his hip, not on his gun, but close enough to make his point clear. "Horse threw a shoe up north," the stranger said. "Been riding dry for hours." Wes nodded toward the trough. "Water's there." The man dismounted and let his horse drink, then wiped his brow with a grimy handkerchief. His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of Eleanor through the kitchen window, bouncing the baby in her arms. "That your woman?" he asked with a knowing smirk. Wes said nothing. "Saw her once back in Silk Creek." "Name's Eleanor Hargrove, ain't it?" Wes's posture changed. "You know her?" "Not personally. Just know the name." "Hell, most folks west of the Kansas River do. She's the widow of Caleb Hargrove." The stranger let that hang in the air like gun smoke. "Guess I ought to let certain folks know she's out this way. Ain't everybody made peace with what her husband did?" Wes stepped forward. "You do that, you won't ride far." The man raised both hands in mock surrender. Just talking, mister. Just talking. He mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode off into the falling darkness. Wes stood there long after the hoofbeats faded, jaw clenched tight as winter. Underscore 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 underscore. That night, Wes didn't speak during supper. Eleanor noticed but didn't press. When the baby was asleep and the fire had died to embers, Wes turned to her with eyes like flint. How long were you going to keep it from me? Eleanor looked up from her stitching. What? Your name? Hargrove. Your husband, Caleb Hargrove. She swallowed hard. I figured you knew. I knew, he said, voice tightening. I just wanted to hear it from you. She folded the baby's shirt in her lap. I never touched a gun. Never helped him rob banks. But that name followed me like rot. You think I care about a name? Wes stood, pacing. That man, your husband, he rode with the same gang that murdered my family. Eleanor's voice cracked. I know. You know, he shouted. Do you know what it's like to come home to silence? To find your wife with her throat cut and your boy shot in his own bed? Tears welled in her eyes. Do you think I chose him? I was 18. He came to town wearing charm like a badge, promising better than laundry wages and broken windows. He lied like a poet. Wes turned away, fists clenched. I didn't know what he was until it was too late. When I tried to leave, he locked me in that cabin and rode off with blood on his hands. I hated him, Wes. I hated him before the gallows ever took him. You should have told me, he said. And if I had, you'd have turned us away. I don't know, he admitted. I honestly don't know. Long silence stretched between them. The fire popped once, soft and hollow. Eleanor stood, holding her child close. If you want us gone, say it now. Wes looked at her, really looked, at the thin line of her shoulders, the way her hand shielded the baby's head, the exhaustion in her eyes that had nothing to do with sleep. I don't want you gone, he said at last. She didn't reply, just sank into the rocker beside the fire and began to rock her son gently, the way only a woman who'd lost too much could. Outside, the wind picked up, and in that room between the shadows of names long dead and the breathing warmth of something still alive, neither spoke another word. But both knew the past had come knocking, and it wouldn't be the last time. Underscore 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 underscore. The gunman came at dawn. Wes was sharpening fence posts when he spotted them, 3 riders on the ridge, black coats flapping like carrion birds, moving with the cold patience of men who knew how to wait and kill. He ducked inside. One look at his face told Eleanor everything. They're not here for you, he said low. They're here for me. I once shot a man named Reese Gallo. He was their leader. Did it to stop a massacre, but I never paid the price. Eleanor tightened her grip on the baby. What do? We fight smart. They worked in desperate silence. Eleanor wrapped the baby in wool and hid him beneath the floorboards under the hearth, whispering soft prayers as she closed the plank. Then she grabbed 2 lanterns and followed Wes to the barn. Light the hay bales, he said. Smoke and confusion. I'll draw them around back. And me? You run. She stared at him. No. Eleanor, I'm tired of running. If this is my home, I protect it. The first rider charged through the gate, gun raised. Wes fired from the loft, taking him down with one clean shot. The second tried to flank the barn but hit a tripwire, sending him face first into the snow. The third man kicked open the barn door just as Eleanor hurled her lit lantern. It shattered against the wall, flames racing up the dry timber. Horses screamed in their stalls, smoke filled the rafters, and the gunman cursed, backing into the wind. Wes tackled him from behind. The snow turned red for a moment, then silence. Wes stood, bleeding from a cut across his ribs. He found Eleanor there, breathless, soot on her cheeks, hair wild with ash and wind. You stayed, he said, voice full of wonder. I wasn't going to lose another home, she said simply. He stared at her, stunned. You didn't run. I'm not just someone's widow anymore. I'm someone's mother. And maybe someone's something more. Inside, she cleaned his wound with boiled water, tore strips from her own underskirt, and wrapped him with careful hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she never stopped. Wes watched her, chest tight. No one had touched him with such purpose since his wife died. Outside, snow kept falling. But inside, something else had taken root, quiet and slow and fierce as fire. Underscore 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 spring came slowly to the Kansas plains. The last frost melted from the high grass, and with it the heavy silence that had once weighed down West Thatcher's land. Where snow and sorrow had rested, crocuses and violets pushed through the earth, small, defiant bursts of color along the fence line. Eleanor knelt by the clothesline, pinning up her son's blue shirt, her stitching careful and fine. The boy toddled at her side, chubby fingers grasping at twine, legs unsteady but determined as he tried to follow Wes's shadow wherever it went. That morning, while mending a stirrup, Wes had heard it, soft and clear, "Pa." Just once, but it had landed like thunder. Eleanor had gone pale, then pink, gathering the baby quickly and disappearing inside. That evening, Wes returned with kindling and a small pair of leather boots. He placed the wood in the bin, then set the boots beside the hearth, right between his worn pair and Eleanor's muddy ones. I thought, he said, voice low, he might need them soon. Eleanor's throat tightened. He will. Later, after the baby had fallen asleep, Eleanor rose and walked to the boots. She ran her fingers along the seams, touching where Wes had stitched the leather by hand. He never said the words, but every stitch was a promise. She turned to find him watching from the doorway, arms crossed. Their eyes met. Neither spoke, because between two broken people, some truths were best left to silence, the kind that healed rather than harmed. The next morning, Eleanor found a silver ring wrapped in burlap on the table, dull with age but carefully polished. I can't change what brought us here, Wes said, fingers turning the ring slowly. But I'd be proud if you stayed. Eleanor's throat tightened. She reached out and gently closed his hand around the ring. Then this is home. Behind them, the boy toddled into the yard, arms outstretched, laughing as he stumbled into soft dirt. Look, Mama. We're home now. Eleanor smiled, slipped her hand into Wes's, and said with voice firm as bedrock, yes. We are. They stood like that as the sun set over the Kansas plains, three figures on land once haunted, now healed. No one spoke Caleb Hargrove's name again, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer defined anything. The name on the land was Thatcher. And for the first time in years, it meant something whole. In the distance, meadowlarks sang their evening song, and the wind carried the scent of new grass and possibility across the endless prairie. Home, Eleanor thought, wasn't always about where you came from, sometimes it was about who chose to stay.